In June 2013, a group of Japanese people was visiting North Korea, a country with no diplomatic ties with Japan.
Grandma.
These people had lost relatives in the northern part of the Korean peninsula right after World War II.
Father, Mother, I'm here with Yoshiko to pray for your souls.
Satoru Imamura's parents passed away about 68 years ago.
We brought some sake, your favorite.
Last fall, bereaved Japanese families were allowed to hold a memorial service in North Korea for the first time since World War II. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, nearly 4 million of its citizens were living in areas including Manchuria and the Korean Peninsula. That year, the victorious nations launched repatriation programs to send those people home. The repatriation program started in South Korea in October, in the Republic of China in November, and in Taiwan and Manchuria in spring of the following year. But North Korea didn't get around to it for a year and 4 months. Over 200,000 Japanese were left in North Korea. They suffered from hunger and disease. To survive, even little children had to escape the north on foot.
If they'd found us, we would have been shot. And there was nothing we could do about it. We were like spies on a secret cross-border mission. We constantly thought this could be our last day.
Some 35,000 Japanese died in the north, unable to escape. Many of their remains are still buried in the mountains and fields of North Korea. Why were the Japanese forced to escape on their own? And why were so many lives lost? The issue was shrouded in mystery for nearly 70 years. New documents found in Russia this year have helped provide some answers.
This important document sheds light on the issue of the repatriation of the Japanese who were in North Korea.
The report describes maneuverings between the Soviet Union and the U.S. over Japanese repatriation. The two powers disagreed on some occasions, but joined hands on others. There were new discoveries in Japan as well. It turns out one of the returnees had secretly brought back a large amount of information.
My father procured a boat to escape North Korea.
These documents have revealed that a group of some 150 Japanese people risked their lives in an effort to return to their homeland.
みんな、38度線付近はソ連が厳重に封鎖してるっちゃなしや。わしは海から行こうと思うんや。
お父ちゃん
Why did so many Japanese lose their lives in North Korea immediately following World War II? And how did they try to survive? 68 years after the end of the war, the facts behind previously unknown repatriation attempts have been uncovered for the first time.
conquering.
Satoru Imamura lost his parents in 1946 at a Soviet internment facility in North Korea. This was his first trip to the north to pray for their souls.
My lifelong wish is finally coming true. Now we're about to land. I've dreamed of paying my respects at my parents' grave. I feel overwhelmed with emotion.
For nearly 70 years, Imamura and other bereaved families haven't had a chance to pray to the remains of their loved ones. North Korea has repeatedly ignored Japan's requests for permission to collect the remains and offer prayers. But in the fall of 2012, Pyongyang suddenly decided to allow people to enter to hold memorials. The families visited areas where the bones of Japanese people are said to be buried and the towns where they once lived.
So many people.
North Korea changed its stance last year, right after Kim Jong-un, first secretary of the Workers' Party of Korea, assumed power. The first ever search for remains was conducted ahead of a memorial service. Japanese reporters were also present. This led to the discovery of many human bones and personal items in places where Japanese records indicate the deceased were buried. The deadlock between Pyongyang and Tokyo over the North's subduction of Japanese citizens is said to be behind the decision. Experts say North Korea is looking for a way to improve ties with Japan. The issue of the Japanese remains was neglected for nearly 70 years, but diplomatic dealings have placed it squarely in the spotlight. Imamura grew up in a house near Chongjin, a port city facing the Sea of Japan. In the period of Japanese rule, Chongjin was a center of fishing and trade. Japanese media have rarely been granted access to regional cities like this. Imamura stepped off the bus near his old neighborhood.
The Central Park's over there, isn't it?
A statue of North Korea's founding father, Kim Il-sung, now faces the spot where Imamura's house once stood.
This is the bridge, so right around there. My old home must have been right there.
This area was once the busiest part of town, but all traces of that past are gone.
It's been 68 years. I can only imagine this was it. If the house was still standing, I would know for sure. But it's gone.
In 1910, Japan brought the Korean peninsula under its control. North Korea was rich in natural resources, and the Japanese built many factories, turning out supplies for the military. Some 300,000 Japanese were living there. Imamoto's father, Mitsuo, had moved to the Korean Peninsula as a soldier. After leaving the military, he stayed in North Korea and opened a bicycle shop. His business took off thanks to many orders from the military. Imamoto's fondest wartime memory is how he played with a slingshot his father made out of bicycle parts. On August 9, 1945, the Soviet Union broke a neutrality pact with Japan and invaded Manchuria. Soviet forces also entered the Korean Peninsula. The Imamotos were living near Chongjin at the time. The town became a battlefield and was seized by the Soviets. After the war, the Soviet Union and the U.S. agreed to divide the Korean Peninsula at the 38th parallel. Soviet troops occupied the north, and American forces took the south. In late August, the Soviets sealed off the 38th parallel. Japanese military personnel were sent to Siberia, while civilians were prohibited from traveling. Soon after Chongjin fell, some Soviet troops suddenly barged into the Imamoto's house.
My mother and sister hid in the attic space above the toilet. Women were often sexually assaulted, so they would dress like men. They had their hair cropped, really short too.
Fearing for their safety, the Imamotos decided to load a cart with their belongings and flee. But they were robbed by local Koreans in retaliation for Japan's colonial rule.
When they found us, they'd take us to places like an open field or a school gymnasium. Then they'd line us up, check our luggage, and take whatever they wanted without saying a word.
Didn't you resist?
Well, we couldn't. They'd have killed us.
Amid the chaos immediately after the war, the Japanese government wasn't doing much to protect the Japanese in North Korea. Government officials figured an influx of people returning from Korea or Taiwan would cause shortages of jobs, food, and housing at home. So they drafted a policy urging the expatriates to endure their hardships and coexist with the locals for the time being. But in reality, coexistence wasn't possible. Eager to escape violence and pillaging, many Japanese rushed south with hopes of returning to Japan. Soviet troops captured them along the way. After more than 3 months as fugitives, the Imamotos found themselves in Hamhung, a town in the eastern part of North Korea. The place was full of Japanese who had fled other regions in the north. Soviet troops had seized most of the Japanese homes there. They put the refugees in the few that remained. Meanwhile, The town's wartime Japanese population had tripled to 30,000. Living conditions had grown much worse. The Imamoto family was interned in a local residence. They suffered from poor hygiene and hunger due to the lack of food.
We couldn't eat or take baths. We were malnourished, and our clothes were dirty, infested with fleas and lice. We were always hungry, starving. Couldn't think of anything else.
A group of Japanese in Hamhon put this report together later. The Japanese did physical labor and worked for the Soviet military. One of the biggest tasks was digging their own graves. Some of the Japanese thought that 10% of them would die during the winter, so they dug enough graves for 3,000 people. But it turned out a much harsher fate was in store for Imamoto and the other Japanese. While more and more Japanese were interned, some had escaped the eyes of the Soviet troops and lived in hiding. Kimiko Yokota is 92 years old. She managed to lie low with her family, including her eldest daughter, Kikuko.
Here's a picture of the family when we returned to Japan. This is my father, my mother, and my siblings.
Living in hiding were Kimiko, her husband Kyuji, and their 4 children. The Yokotas had a tailor shop in Songjin, a town in northeastern North Korea. When they returned to Japan, they brought with them a large number of documents. These included personal notes on conditions right after the war and records of negotiations with Soviet troops. Even researchers didn't know such documents existed. They shed light on the severe conditions facing the Japanese. In Songjin, too, Soviet troops burst into Japanese people's homes regardless of the time of day. Kimiko and the children hid in a bomb shelter under the floor and waited for the soldiers to go away.
Там кто-нибудь есть?
Ты здесь? Никого нет.
Точно?
Нет, нет.
At night, you could clearly hear the sound of footsteps coming closer and closer. No walls were too high for Soviet soldiers. There was pillage and rape. Yes, women were raped all the time. In fact, a woman who'd been raped was once carried into the home of Mr. Nishiwaki, a tinsmith next door. I was just a child, but I remember seeing things like that.
While many of the Japanese feared local retaliation for Japan's colonial rule, the Yokota family was given shelter by a Korean friend.
家族の皆さん元気ですか？
おかげさまで元気や。
よかった。
His name was Kang Dong-cho. He ran a clothing store under the Japanese name of Marui. We became friends and he did everything he could to help us. We're alive because of him.
While in hiding, Kyuji started preparing to flee North Korea. Using skills he developed as a tailor, he was making things the family needed to escape. The Yokotas survived a long winter and waited till spring to make their move. Meanwhile, the Imamotas were interned in Hamhon. They were hungry and infested with lice. Around January 1946, all 5 of them contracted epidemic typhus, an infectious disease. The entire family was quarantined in a building managed by the Soviet forces. Imamoto and his father, Mitsuo, were in the same room. They were running high fevers, but received little treatment. Then, the following month, on the 14th of February,
While my father was being carried away on a stretcher, a translator just said, "Your father's passed away. They're going to bury him." I remember those words, though everything else was a blur because of the fever. I didn't even see my father's face when he died.
the day after Imamoto's father, Mitsuo, left this world, so did his mother, Chika. Owing to an epidemic of infectious disease, the death toll in Hamhon kept growing. Over 7,700 people died overall, or 1 in every 4 Japanese. After losing both parents, Imamoto learned how to survive North Korea's brutal winter from other Japanese he didn't even know. Someone, for instance, taught him how to roll cigarettes.
This is what it looked like. I still remember the Korean expression for, "Would you like a cigarette?"
He says to avoid starvation, he secretly sold cigarettes to Korean people.
Looking back now, I think I owe my life to people like them.
Remaining interned would most likely mean death. Many Japanese in the camp gradually began thinking about escaping in the spring. As one of the war's victors, the Soviet Union imposed military rule on North Korea. The United States, the Republic of China, and other victorious nations had already begun sending Japanese back home. What was the Soviet Union's plan? No Soviet records concerning the Japanese refugees were found for many years. Their story long remained a mystery. Professor Chon Hyun-soo, an historian from South Korea, discovered some of those records. They were found among classified Soviet military documents.
These documents will be crucial in learning how the Japanese in North Korea were sent back home.
It was confirmed for the first time that the Soviets knew from early on of the bitter conditions the Japanese faced.
It's written here that in September 1945, 288 Japanese died of hunger in a city in northern North Korea.
The Soviets also knew that Japanese refugees were starving to death around Pyongyang every day. Other important facts also came to light. In January 1946, the United States and Soviet Union held talks about evacuating Japanese refugees in North Korea. Even though North Korea was under Soviet rule, the Soviets tried to make the U.S. pay for the evacuation. In the discussions, the Soviet Union insisted that the United States supply the rice to feed the refugees. But the U.S. rejected the proposal. Instead, the United States made a crucial offer to ship the Japanese home from Pusan and other ports in South Korea if the Soviets brought them to the ports by train. However, the Soviets refused.
The two governments couldn't agree on how much each would pay for food and transportation. The evacuees needed to be fed and transported by ship and railway. Which side would shoulder the larger part of the burden, and which would be responsible for less? Even though they started negotiations only 6 months after the war, they couldn't reach a compromise. And the talks were broken off.
The records show the Soviets knew they had to send the Japanese home, but their reluctance to tackle the issue led to more refugees dying in North Korea. As the talks continued, Kim Il-sung, who had been working with the Soviets, took the helm of North Korea's new government, the Provisional People's Committee. His assumption of power further strengthened Soviet influence over North Korea. Then, in the month after Kim's appointment, Soviet occupation forces started to move out of Manchuria. With the withdrawal of the Soviet Union, the United States and the Republic of China began evacuating some 1 million Japanese from Manchuria. But the Soviets, who controlled North Korea, were reluctant to begin similar evacuation programs there. New evidence shows that the Soviet Union again postponed evacuating the Japanese. Kiyofumi Kato studies the post-war repatriation issue. In March this year, he found new information in Russia. Copying the documents was prohibited, so he wrote down the information. In April 1946, the Soviet Union's Ministry of Foreign Affairs asked the Soviet Navy to estimate the number of ships needed for the evacuation. 50 6,000-ton ships would be needed to evacuate the 230,000 Japanese refugees. One month after the assessment, the Navy sent a letter to the Foreign Office. They said vessels for transporting Japanese refugees did not fall under their jurisdiction. They said the Defense Ministry was responsible. So the bargaining went on, but the parties could not reach a compromise. Time passed.
There was no communication between the ministries. So when the ministries couldn't deal with an issue, they couldn't solve the problem. Then they'd ask the Kremlin what to do. That means it took time before orders were given and actions taken. It was a structural problem within the Soviet government.
In the spring of 1946, while the Soviets were delaying the evacuation, Japanese refugees in Hamhon, where Imamoto was staying, were discussing plans to escape. They knew it was going to be dangerous. But around May, Imamoto and about 30 others left Hamhon. They walked through the mountains during the night to avoid being spotted and headed for the 38th parallel, 200 kilometers away.
We could have been discovered at any moment. They'd found out we were Japanese. There's no telling what they would have done to us. We didn't want to die. We feared being raped or beaten to death. All we thought of was reaching home as soon as we could. Babies cry. What can you do? But we fear that people would hear the crying and find us. We had nothing to eat. So naturally, the mother couldn't nurse the baby. I guess the mother felt the baby would eventually die and it was a burden on the others. One day, the baby was not there anymore.
Many couldn't keep up. They died on the way. Imamoto's group walked through the mountains for nearly 2 months. They crossed the 38th parallel and were taken into custody by the U.S. in early June. Then they were sent home from Pusan. Around that time, numerous Japanese who had escaped North Korea were gathering south of the military border. U.S. forces occupying South Korea were burdened with the enormous cost of harboring and transporting the evacuees and treating the diseases they brought with them. The surging numbers became a problem for the United States. The situation was made clear in this letter sent by U.S. Army officials to their Soviet counterparts. Corrective action must be taken of your handling of the Japanese refugees crossing the 38th parallel. In the newly discovered document, the U.S. asked the Soviets to increase efforts to stop the refugees from crossing the border. The result was increased torment for refugees trying to escape. In early June, when Imamura escaped, around 4,800 Japanese were taken into custody every day, but by the end of the month, the number plummeted. On some days, only 2 made it across the border. The U.S. sent another letter, this time thanking the Soviet military for its cooperation.
みんなこれを見てくれるか。38度線付近はソ連が厳重に封鎖してるっちゃなしや。わしは海から行こうと思うんや。
The Soviet military was tightening security, and Kyuji, who had been hiding in the northeast region of North Korea, was planning an escape. They would cross the 38th parallel by boat.
Here it is.
The Yokota family kept a list of the people who had escaped with them. Their ages ranged from 1 to 65. The lives of 151 people were in the hands of 32-year-old Kyuji. A Korean friend of Kyuji's, who had hidden the family, arranged for a ship to take them south. They embarked on a sailboat and prayed for the wind to blow. But the sea was quiet, and 3 days after their departure, they were running out of drinking water. The sea is dead calm. It is sweltering in the cabin. We are running out of water and have started rationing.
みんな、わしはこれから陸に上がって水を取ってくる。
They were about 60 kilometers north of the 38th parallel.
Вы японцы? Что вы здесь делаете? Вперед! Пошли с нами! Вперед, вперед, вперед!
Kyuji gave the Soviets cash to let them go. But the soldiers told them to leave the woman, too.
所先に逃がそうとして今こっち向かってます。友達お願いしますお父ちゃん。
I remember seeing my husband running down the cliff. He slid down. Just as he reached the ship, the wind started blowing. It was so close. The wind blew, and we shipped out as fast as we could.
But what they feared most still awaited them. The captain stopped the ship, saying it was too dangerous to proceed. He made the Japanese refugees go ashore before reaching the border, where Soviet security was tightest. Yokota's group had to move through rugged mountain trails to avoid being discovered. The bodies of those who died trying to escape lay everywhere along the route.
Bodies were left along the trail here and there, wherever we went. When they went over the mountain, when they escaped, they probably died of hunger. There was no food, and disease was rampant. There were bodies all over the place, everywhere.
They finally crossed the border a week after they set sail. And after that, an American ship took them home to Japan. Yokota's children wore shoes and rucksacks that Kyuji had made with his own hands to prepare them for the ordeal.
This is what our father made for us.
Kikuko has kept them as reminders of their father.
This is the rucksack I carried on my back. These are the shoes my father made. He made all of this himself.
Kyuji sewed a name tag with their address in Japan onto the sack, so the children could find their way home even if he and Kimiko didn't make it.
The situation was very dangerous, and the chances of everyone reaching home were slim. And this was my father's way of protecting us, in case both he and my mother died. I feel his deep love for us whenever I look at them.
The 151 Japanese who left North Korea with Kyuji all arrived safely in Japan. By the end of the year, more than 200,000 Japanese had escaped on their own by sea or land. It was not until December 1946 that the Soviets started repatriating the Japanese in North Korea. But only 8,000 refugees made it home with help from the Soviet Union. Most of the Japanese had already left the country on their own. Right after the war, some 35,000 Japanese were unable to evacuate. They died in North Korea, longing for home. Imamura has come to the town where his parents died. When his father passed away on that cold winter day in the internment camp, Imamura was only 11 years old.
Father, Mother, I've come to visit your grave. It took me 67 years, but I've come. Please, rest in peace. I bought the sake that you like so much, and I want to drink with you today.
Imamura told his parents that he survived all the hardships and escaped North Korea, and that he worked hard to build a life in post-war Japan.
I'm sorry I couldn't let you know earlier, but I got married 50 years ago. These are the photos of the wedding. We were blessed with 4 children and 12 grandchildren. I want you to know we're all happy and well, so don't worry. And thank you for all you did.
Immediately after World War II, Japanese expatriates in North Korea were stranded, left behind by their country. The winners of the war also failed to help. With ties between Japan and North Korea severed, the surviving families were not allowed to visit the graves of their loved ones for many years. Many people died trying to escape on their own, never again to see their homes. 68 years have passed, but their remains are still buried in the fields and mountains of North Korea.
NHK World, your eyes